Today we're talking about conversion therapy. Now, most people do believe that conversion therapy is not helpful, that it's been tried, and that it's shown to not do what it promises to do and actually to cause harm in a lot of cases. And all of those things are true. So a lot of laws have been passed against it, but it is still happening, and it's still happening a lot. The thing is that people who are doing conversion therapy, teaching all the principles of conversion therapy, doing all the same things, now will say that it's not what they're doing. They will deny it point blank. They will say they're not doing conversion therapy. And the thing is, they get away with it because most people know so little about it. So would you, if someone was right in front of your face teaching conversion therapy, and they were telling all the principles and all these things that have been tried and failed so many times before, but said, we don't do conversion therapy, we're doing something different. Do you know enough to tell the difference? Do you know enough to tell the difference? By the end of this video, you definitely will. So I want to talk about one specific ministry, and you've probably figured this out already. I believe that they are practicing conversion therapy, and I think it's pretty clear, and once you learn a little bit, it will be clear. That ministry is called Out Ministries. Out Ministries has a lot of support. They speak at conferences, at churches. They speak at schools to kids. They have a documentary. They have a television show. They have books, and those books get distributed often for free to pastors and influential people in the church. And they influence probably thousands of people every year. This stuff is very, very alive and well. So I want to look into what they're doing a little bit. And let's begin by looking at a video of Michael Carducci, who is one of the founding members and leaders of the ministry, talking about this very subject. Now I get to talk to you about an organization I absolutely love. Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International. They're especially focused on Adventists, people of Adventist heritage, or who are connected to Adventists and who are either allies or LGBTQ people themselves. They're an affirming organization, and they have meant the world to me. When I was first coming out, it was a really difficult time, and they were absolutely there for me. People from the organization talk to me. I'm a member, which gives me access to all kinds of social media groups. I watch their YouTube channels, the resources on their website. It's a fantastic organization. I suggest you check them out. Link in the show notes.
So Reparative Therapy, Out Ministries, gets accused of being reparative or conversion therapy, and many people may not even raise your hand if you know what conversion or reparative therapy is.
Most people don't.
Not many of you. So let me clarify this just a little bit. Conversion and reparative therapy are basically about behaviors. They're about making gay people straight.
Okay, I want to notice real quick here that he is equating conversion therapy and reparative therapy, which I would agree with. Reparative therapy being a type of conversion therapy and the most important one.
And so if we can change your behavior, then you're cured, no problem. So some of the modalities that they use to basically get gay people to act straight is they use electric shock, they use ECT. You know what ECT is? It's where they put the electrodes to your head and they send an electrical current that scrambles the brain. And hopefully the idea is that the brain settles back and you'll be heterosexual. Not only that, they do harmful modalities like they'll take the gay person and he'll be naked, and then a man who's heterosexual will hold the naked homosexual man until all of his desires subside.
I want to explain this one really quick because there's an interesting theory behind it. The idea is that gay men, because it was primarily and is primarily used with men, are gay because their relationship with their same-sex parent or with those of their gender growing up was broken. And so they have a broken understanding of their own gender, and that it's that gender wound that needs to be healed because of the pain in their relationship with the same-sex parent. So the idea was that if they could reparent the gay man and he could feel love, the child part of him could feel love as if from a parent, then that gender issue, alienation, would be resolved, and then he could become a straight man. So there was a theory behind it that I think is really important to note, and that's what reparative therapy is actually all about.
As he's receiving masculine love, the idea is that this is going to cure that. Or they'll do shock treatments and they'll show him gay porn until they shock him to the point where he's not aroused by that anymore. Does that even sound humane?
No.
So let me be very clear. Coming Out Ministries does not promote this. We have never experienced this, and this is not what Coming Out Ministries is about. These are all behavior modifications. These are all things that the world can offer you through behavior change. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with behavior modification, but what we're talking about is a divine intervention and a divine restoration. If you understand this clearly, then that will change your approach to anyone that you come into contact with, because you can divorce yourself from this attitude. It's like you're not redeemed because you're in a straight relationship and you have children. You're redeemed because you claim the blood of Jesus Christ. Is that fair to say?
That's great.
And so again, recognizing that there are very harmful effects of these modalities, we do not connect ourselves to that. We do not endorse it or promote it. What we're talking about is a divine intervention of God's power and grace to redeem all sexual sin. I thought that was worthy of an amen, didn't you?
What he's doing in equating conversion therapy and reparative therapy is very helpful. And what he's doing in repudiating something like aversion therapy, which is different than conversion therapy, aversion therapy is very good. Like, I'm so glad that he's doing that, because aversion therapy is horribly destructive. I know many people who have received aversion therapy. In fact, I just talked to someone yesterday who had received aversion therapy, and he tried with the electric shocks and everything. It was a mild shock, which it usually was. And he said it just like made him so anxious. It just kind of messed him up. It didn't help him at all to not be gay. So it's great that Michael Carducci is saying these things are wrong. Great. That's good. What I have a question with is whether that is actually the sum total of what conversion therapy is. And I also have a question with what he says at the end, because it's so non-specific. Like, I feel like the reason people didn't say amen right away is because maybe they were still trying to understand what he meant. Like, what does that mean? God's going to redeem. Like there's so much there that it's just like awesome. Like, yeah, heterosexuality, getting married and having kids doesn't save you. Awesome. Like, sometimes the church really needs to hear that. Like, that's great. But when he talks about the redemption of God, what is he talking about? If it's not behavior change, what is it? Is it making gay people straight? Is it an identity? Like, what is it? What is it? And that's what we need to unpack and see if it relates to conversion therapy. Now I want to show you a video by Wayne Blakely. Wayne is one of the founding members of Coming Out Ministries, and he has his own ministry now, but he still continues to have the support of Coming Out Ministries. You can see on their website, they speak positively of him. He's still in videos that are on their website, and he's still doing much of the same thing. So he is here kind of talking about conversion therapy and definitions of conversion therapy.
So I find it particularly interesting that we don't have clear definition, but the definition is coming out by those who have an agenda. If you go to Webster's dictionary, it will tell you that it's anything that suggests somebody live differently than how they feel.
Okay, so he's saying that this is the definition of conversion therapy you find in Webster's dictionary. I couldn't verify that. That wasn't the definition of conversion therapy or the definition of conversion. So I think he's muddying the waters a bit here, and he's trying to define it much more broadly. It's, as somebody who is a communicator, and that's what I do, like, it's much easier to do that kind of thing than you realize, to remember something wrong kind of within the way that you're thinking. But it's really important to try to get things right. So he's saying we don't have a very clear definition. It's defined by people with an agenda. That's not really true. We actually do know what it is.
Well, if we're going to criminalize that concept,
It's not criminal.
then it could extend way beyond LGBT and other areas of life based on feelings alone.
Okay, so this gives me a chance to clarify some things. Conversion therapy is not criminalized. Like, you can't go to prison. What they do is they fine people who practice it, but for the most part, it's only people who practice it with minors and only mental health professionals who practice it. So what he's talking about how it can be applied to anything and all that, like, that's not really something that you need to worry about. Conversion therapy is something about which there actually are some pretty clear rules and laws and definitions. because, when you put something into law, it has to be clear enough that that law can actually be enforced. There have been a lot of different approaches to conversion therapy. So there is a history that comes with it and a lot of methodologies and philosophies that people have used to approach conversion therapy. And those are identifiable, and it's important that we do a quick and dirty of those. So think of conversion therapy as an umbrella term. Under the umbrella of conversion therapy, you have multiple approaches. So Michael Carducci wonderfully disavowed some of those approaches, which are really negative, like aversion therapy. So the idea is that you take the stimulus that you want to get rid of, which is attraction to someone of the same gender, and you pair it to a negative stimulus, hoping that it'll make that original stimulus go away. So it's very Pavlovian. So you have something that's going to make a person feel attraction to the same sex, and then immediately there's a negative stimulus. So there's a shock, or there is induced vomiting, or sometimes people will even just be told to keep a rubber band around their wrist and flick it onto that flesh, that soft part of the flesh every time they experience attraction to someone of the same gender. So he correctly disavows those. Those are still going on, super problematic. I know tons of people who have been through it. So he disavows aversion therapy. ECT is no longer really practiced. That's the electric shock one he talked about. Another one that he doesn't reference here, but that may come up later, is the addictions model. So people have used, they might call it Homosexuals Anonymous, or an addictions model to treat sexual orientation of gay and bisexual people as if it was an addiction, and go through a modified version of the 12 steps to try to deal with it. And then there's the one Michael Carducci referenced, and that is reparative therapy. Reparative therapy is probably the most important type of conversion therapy, actually, because it has the longest history, it's had the most vocal proponents, and the most respected historically proponents, though the proponents are not really respected anymore because their theories have been so discredited. But we're going to talk more about reparative therapy. And again, like that hugging we talked about, reparative therapy goes back to this theory about this kind of wounded sense of gender from the childhood. And it can be easily identified with a couple really quick things that go into something called the ex-gay narrative. So the ex-gay narrative, it's often called that because of its association with Exodus International and the ex-gay movement, but it goes back actually much, much further than that. So I want to look at a video of a couple of the people from Out Ministries talking about their stories and identify why I believe that these stories incorporate all the keystone ideas of reparative therapy, because they're sharing their ex-gay narrative. Before we get started on this, I just want to point out that there are about to be some references to sexual assault, and if that is not something that's you're comfortable with, or if there's some littles around, you might want to skip this or come back to it later at your discretion.
And I was one who was sexually molested as a very young child, 4 years old. I was repeatedly molested in grade school, and I think I was pushed away from my peer group and pushed away from my gender through mocking and making fun and through molestation.
Every time I listen to their testimonies, and I've listened to many, many hours of their testimonies, it's so sad to me, so much of what they went through. And you can't help but part of you admire the willingness and the vulnerability to talk about things that frankly are not talked about enough in church. We don't talk about sexual assault and trauma and childhood trauma and recovering from those things as much as we should in church. And it takes some courage to be willing to do that. And it takes some courage even to acknowledge that you're attracted to the same gender in a church setting. So I want to affirm the courage that it takes for them to share these stories. What I am doing is not trying to in any way diminish that. But I do think we have a responsibility to pay attention to when their story ends and when their analysis and the ideas that they are putting onto their story begin, because often those ideas are the ones that kind of get universalized and encouraged for others to apply. And it says not just, here's what happened to me and it was difficult and traumatic, but the assumption that this is the thing that made me gay, or the thing that made me trans, or part of the queer community. So I want to separate those two and say it is legitimate and even important that we examine some of the assumptions and the ideas and the psychological theories that go into their analysis of their stories. But I really hope that I can be respectful of their stories in doing so. So I just want to point out that he's talking about being pushed away and alienated from his gender at a young age.
And I ended up eventually going into the gay life and spent many years there.
From my first conscious moment, I thought it was a girl. There was no doubt in my mind from my earliest thoughts. And it wasn't until I came back at 40 years old that I made this demand of God. I wanted to know how I was transgendered at my earliest thoughts.
I think it's important to point out that it was when he went back at the age of 40 that he came back with a question, and within that question was an assumption that there was a reason why he was transgender in his earliest thoughts, as he says. And that at the age of 40, he wanted to look back all those decades and have God show him the causative factors of his gender identity and his orientation, as you'll see in a moment.
And through science and through the Bible, it started to show me that there was a breakdown between my father and me, the same-sex parent. And my dad was either unavailable for me, or when he was angry and abusive. So
he's talking about a science behind that, a science that helped him understood these things. The only possible explanation for what could be a science that taught him that his relationship with his father caused these things is the science of reparative therapy. I don't know what else he could possibly be referring to. If somebody knows something else, let me know. But that is what reparative therapy teaches, and I don't know of any other approach that teaches that.
I didn't want that sexuality or that identity, and so I went to my mom. So my earliest thoughts after consciousness is that I should be like my sisters. Without another role model that I found acceptable, I just started patterning that way, and I thought that if I prayed hard enough that maybe God would turn me into a little girl and everything would be all right.
So it's that breakdown of the relationship with the same gender parent that caused him to disidentify from his gender. So both of these people are talking about like a gender alienation at an early age.
So that eventually led to same-sex attraction.
Again,
through some exposure to my best friends engaging in a homosexual act. All of these things were having an influence on me. And
so probably he was also familiar with straight people who engaged in heterosexual acts, but it was the same-sex acts that he sees as really being influential on him.
I was never molested like Ron was, but there were definitely some influences that were helping to shape that. At 20 years old, I finally was okay with being male, because coming out of church culture into gay culture, masculinity was more valuable. And so if I butched it up a little bit and worked out in the gym, I found that I got all the attention from men that I wanted. So it was like I went from one side of the ditch to the other.
Carducci said that when he entered the gay male community, he realized that masculinity was more valuable than femininity. And that at that point, he essentially dropped the trans identity and stopped wanting to be a woman. I think that this is really against the grain of the vast majority of people who would describe themselves as transgender. It's hard to imagine a world in which anyone would see being a transgender woman as, quote, more valuable than being a cisgender man. And the experience of trans people is that their life is made more difficult in terms of the people around them and their families and social acceptance. There's a lot of violence against the trans community, and yet they do it anyways because of this strong internal sense of who they are as people. So his story really goes against the grain, and I wouldn't want it to be seen at all as representative of the trans community. Again, I want to point out the difference between his story of what actually happened with the bullying, with the teasing for both of them, with their interpretation of it, that in Michael's case was developed when he was 40. And he came to it with the assumption that something had happened to go wrong, and he refers to a science that he studied. And the only thing that would ever have been categorized as a science that would teach these types of principles would in fact be reparative therapy, the very thing that he refuted in the first video that we watched. So this is why I would identify this as an ex-gay narrative, because it's a story from childhood that has trauma and difficulty and pain, and it particularly involves alienation from a same-sex parent or other explanations for why someone might have been alienated from their own gender. And those events are seen as causative of the person's sexuality. These things are very commonly taught in reparative therapy, and it is very easy to trace, and it's very easy to see. And this is something that was really a big part of Exodus International and the ex-gay movement, which we will look at more closely in another video. But for now, I want to go ahead and go back to Wayne Blakely and look at his story.
My natural mother carried me to full-term pregnancy. People would ask if she wanted to have a boy or a girl, and she was very adamant about the fact that she was having a baby girl. There was no way she was going to have a boy. I was a boy, I am a boy, and she couldn't give me back, and she couldn't return me or exchange me.
Again, this is so painful. It's painful to express something like this. And even though it was many years ago, and even though this is a story he's told many times, you can still see the pain of that situation.
And so this caused her great grief and disappointment. And instead of bonding with my mother, I didn't have that luxury. I was rejected. I was alienated. I was pushed away from her from the very, very beginning. And so rejection for me came from a woman, and it was from my very own mother. So it wasn't likely that I was going to end up running to the arms of a woman to seek love. I entered into school, and because I was effeminate, I was trying to be the little girl that my natural mother wanted me to be, because I wanted that acceptance so bad. It was already implanted in my brain. And so that, of course, alienated me amongst other boys in school. And so I was teased and harassed and pushed around throughout all my school days, from the beginning to the end. I wanted so much to be accepted by my own gender, and so it only makes sense that I was seeking affirmation. I was drawn to the same gender because that gender was the one that didn't seem to give me the affirmation that I needed, and so I wanted that closeness, I wanted protection, I wanted the masculinity, and I didn't have it.
I want to point out how flexible the narrative is. Michael Carducci is gay because his relationship with his father was disrupted. So, of course, he was looking for relationships with men to kind of heal that. Wayne Blakely is gay because his relationship with his mother was problematic. And so, of course, he didn't want to receive intimacy from that gender. So he went with men. So there's this flexibility to it. And it's like, of course, the of course doesn't mean anything at a certain point, because anything can be used to kind of say anything. And anything that goes into this negative bucket of childhood trauma can be seen as causative for same-sex sexuality. And you very much see that reflected in the literature. But this might raise all kinds of other questions for you about, where did this ex-gay narrative come from? How do we know that it doesn't work? What's been tried? What's been the results of it? And I just want to talk to you about all those things because they're so interesting. So hit that subscribe button if you want to follow and learn more about this subject and all kinds of other subjects I talk about that are relevant to Christians who are wanting to understand how they can better embody the values of Christ for the LGBTQ community and understanding the Bible and all kinds of things like that. So hit that subscribe button if you're interested in that. I want to do a video with more in-depth response to one of the ex-gay narratives so we can learn a little bit more about how they work and why they're problematic. And then we're going to dive into where all this stuff comes from. So it's going to be interesting. Now, I don't know how you found this video. I don't know if you are questioning your own sexuality, if you're part of the queer community, if you're a pastor who's considering coming out ministries, or if you're just interested in making a difference in this area, you want to be a better ally, you're a parent, whatever it may be, there is a really good chance that you are experiencing some fear and some difficulty around this question. based on whatever might have brought you to this video. I really want to say to you, whoever you are, when you're having questions, difficulty, fear, and uncertainty, fall back on what you know, which is that God is a God of love. God is not sitting around waiting for you to get the wrong answer so that you can be punished. God cares about you. God sees your sincerity, and you need to trust in that and know that it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So thank you so much for joining me, and we will talk to you later.